4 years ago, I was 20 years old, and I loved the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I actually jumped on board the MCU a bit late, around the middle of Phase 2, the days of Iron Man 3 and Captain America the Winter Soldier. The first MCU movie I got to see in theaters was Avengers Age of Ultron. I remember when the first schedule for Phase 3 was announced, Captain America Serpent Society was actually Captain America Civil War, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, all building to Infinity War Parts 1 and 2 that, of course, eventually became Infinity War and Endgame. I remember driving home from watching Infinity War for the first time, giddy with excitement, so in love with this franchise and so ready to see where it went next, how my heroes would solve this. I was shocked when Endgame began with its 5-year time skip. I cheered when Captain America wielded Mjolnir. I cried when Tony Stark sacrificed himself by using the Infinity Stones to snap away Thanos and his army. And probably like many of you, I began to speculate in eager anticipation about what the next era of this franchise would look like. What would the future hold? It's been 4 years since Endgame. I'm 24 years old now, and I don't love the MCU anymore. In fact, out of everything that came out in Phase 4, I watched 3.5 things: Black Widow, Spider-Man No Way Home, WandaVision, and the first half of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I didn't even finish it. There was no Eternals, no Loki, no Thor Love and Thunder, not Moon Knight or Shang-Chi or the Multiverse of Madness. I watched practically nothing in Phase 4, and not because I found all of it terrible, it was just because I didn't get around to it. It wasn't a conscious decision to stop watching. I didn't do it on purpose. It just sort of happened. I watched Black Widow in theaters with the full intent of continuing to watch everything that Marvel put out. But by the time Marvel announced Phases 5 and 6 in July of last year, I realized how little I had seen, and more than that, just how little I cared. None of these movies or shows interested me. None of the promises made gave me any sort of excitement. There's nothing the MCU has planned that makes me care. Except for one thing.
We were gone for quite a while.
Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is the only MCU thing that has inspired true excitement in me since Endgame. I have watched the trailers at least once a day since they dropped. The promise of James Gunn finishing a trilogy he started almost 10 years ago is the one thing that is going to get me back into the theater to watch a Marvel movie. And after that, I'm done. With whatever big overarching Kang story they've got going on, I feel like I'm either on the train watching everything or I'm off it and watching nothing. And so after Guardians 3, I am off. But I guess the question then becomes, why this? Why is this the movie that I'm going out on, the movie I'm saying goodbye with? Why do I care about this and not the new Captain America with Sam Wilson, an idea I was always behind even before Endgame? Why not a new Daredevil series with Charlie Cox, Netflix's Daredevil being perhaps my favorite thing to come out of the MCU? Why the Guardians of the Galaxy? And I think the best way to answer that question is to explore my favorite MCU movie, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Not because I don't like the first movie, far from it. In fact, this was supposed to be a video about both movies, but I found myself struggling to write it that way. Because as much as I love the first movie, I think the answer to this question lies in its sequel. Because it's a movie that I think stands in stark contrast to what the MCU has become, perhaps even what it always was. And I think it's this movie specifically that holds the answer as to why these movies, these characters, this story is now the only thing that makes me care about this franchise anymore. Hidden within the messy pacing and structural flaws, all the things that make many people consider this the inferior movie, I think there's something more honest and more resonant to me than any other film the MCU has ever given us. But before we get to that, I want to take a look back at how we got here. I want to start at the beginning and look at the foundations this series was built on and the people who built them. The creation of Guardians of the Galaxy fittingly began in a kind of weird place, a Marvel writing program. Screenwriter Nicole Perlman came into the program in 2009, only a year after the original Iron Man, and was given a list of Marvel properties that were being considered for films. And she chose the Guardians of the Galaxy, which by her own admission was met with some surprise. It was such a strange and obscure series within the strangest and most obscure side of Marvel Comics, but Perlman wanted to write about the team that had Rocket Raccoon. So for 2 whole years, Perlman worked on this project, reading as many of the original comics as she could and writing various drafts with different combinations of Guardians, different character dynamics, and different villains. Fun fact, her inclusion of Thanos as a main villain is actually the reason Thanos and the Infinity Stones became the overarching story of the first 3 phases. But what's most striking is that Perlman was given complete freedom in writing these drafts. There were no mandates or characters she had to include. Like I said, Thanos wasn't even on the docket until Perlman brought him in. She was allowed to do whatever she wanted with this story. I don't usually go into this much detail as to how these scripts come to be, but I think this is important to note. This wasn't a movie that was made because Marvel had some grand plan for how it would be folded into the larger narrative. This wasn't made because they needed to introduce Thanos outside of an end credits scene or establish what the Infinity Stones were. This was made because one person was given a list of properties to choose from, and the one with the talking tree really spoke to them. Guardians of the Galaxy, as we know it now, was a movie built on a foundation of creative freedom and trusting artists, and that only continued with the hiring of the one and only James Gunn. I don't want to dismiss Perlman's work in not only getting this project off the ground, but in building the foundation for what the film would become, even if James Gunn was kind of want to do that himself. But I think it is frankly inarguable that Guardians of the Galaxy, and especially Volume 2, are ultimately Gunn's movies first and foremost. Gunn is a director that seems almost incapable of not putting his stamp on whatever he works on. Whether he's writing or directing, it's very easy to see Gunn in the work he produces, in the dialogue, in the humor, in the visual style. When he makes a movie, he makes a movie. He commits to the bit, sometimes even a little too much, in my opinion. Gunn is a director of excess, if not in his visual style, then in his offbeat humor, in his extreme focus on character, in his love for blood and gore, in his R-rated work. If James Gunn makes a movie, you can bet your ass that it will feel like James Gunn made that movie, for better or worse. Because sometimes you get stuff like Slither that's a lovingly and carefully crafted send-up to horror B-movies of the 80s that's brimming with passion and character. And sometimes you get stuff like Super that, while having its fans, in my opinion, is a lot messier and is rarely able to get anything through the heaps of shock value. But no matter what, no matter how you respond to Gunn's sensibilities, a James Gunn film always feels like a James Gunn film, and that includes Guardians. And there are 3 particular narrative sensibilities that I think not only define Gunn as a storyteller, but also define Guardians as a whole. Starting with number 1, a clear acknowledgement of death. James Gunn has never been one to shy away from the concept of death. Death abounds in Gunn's work, usually in much more gruesome ways than his PG-13 rating allows in Guardians. But it's not the gruesome or gory ways these people die that I think is truly most indicative of Gunn's sensibilities, as much as he obviously loves it when he has access to it. Because as much death as there is in these movies, it's rare for that death to be pointless or just a vehicle for the gore effects.
You have to like the characters. You have to give them a life beyond just being, fodder for death.
When a character dies in a James Gunn movie, it is almost always working towards some other goal, whether it is something as small as making a joke or something as major as revealing or developing character. Take, for example, the opening of the first Guardians movie. It was strange watching this at the time because this was supposed to be the funny, super lighthearted MCU movie. At the time, the MCU didn't yet have an oversaturation of comedy, and it was actually a genuinely unique element of the first film. And when I first watched it, having heard all of those things about it, I wasn't prepared to watch a little kid watch his mother dying of brain cancer in front of him, rejecting her hand and panicking and screaming as she passes. It's not that the MCU had never had a character die or that death had never been a big deal, but it had never been quite so upfront about it, so undeniable. It didn't help that many characters who died in previous MCU movies had already been brought back in other things, but the opening of the first Guardians Guardians sends a very clear message. Death is real, and it's the living who are going to have to deal with it. And Peter is a character that, in refusing to take his mother's hand, refuses to deal with it. And that's not the only place where death lies in these movies. In fact, it's a major facet of almost every one of the Guardians. Not only did Peter's mom die, but Drax's wife and daughter were killed by Ronan, and Gamora's parents were killed by Thanos. And then there's of course Groot's sacrifice at the end of the first movie. So even if James Gunn isn't allowed to show a man literally split in half, death still becomes a defining factor of these movies in a way that it simply hadn't been for any other film in the MCU prior. Then there's number 2, James Gunn likes to get weird. Slither is a movie about an alien parasite creating a hive mind on Earth through slugs that infect you by forcing their way into your mouth. Super is a movie about a man with religious trauma going through a psychotic break after his wife leaves him for a drug dealer, becoming a pipe wrench wielding vigilante called the Crimson Bolt. James Gunn has never been afraid to tell stories and explore characters that might turn a lot of people away. In fact, that's exactly what those 2 movies kind of did. And while the Guardians themselves were not initially Gunn's creations, they are just as suitably weird as Gunn's work in the past. A talking tree who can only say 3 words, an alien warrior who doesn't understand metaphors, a genetically engineered tech genius that looks like a raccoon but isn't a raccoon, don't get that mixed up. The Guardians are, to put it lightly, a very odd group of individuals. These weren't super soldiers or rich dudes with high-tech armor or Norse gods, which are admittedly still kind of strange. But this wasn't the kind of weird that was a big green rage monster, this was the kind of weird that was a smaller, still green assassin who was the adoptive daughter of an alien warlord. This was a weirdness found in specificity. The more specific something gets, the less and less relatable the whole becomes. And this is the kind of weird that James Gunn specializes in. If James Gunn has a talent for anything, it is finding the human in the strange, the familiar in the weird, the relatable in the unrelatable. Most people have never had to face the horror of an alien parasite taking over their small southern town, but a lot of people have had to experience the terror of escaping a toxic relationship. Most people haven't become an incredibly violent vigilante to deal with a difficult breakup, but a lot of us have had to face that deeply entrenched fear of being alone. There's something of a paradox in that weirdness through specificity, that while specificity can make something considerably stranger, it's also that specificity that allows us a greater means of seeing our own reflection within it. The more details there are, the harder it becomes to relate to the whole, but the easier it becomes to relate to one of those details, giving us a way to better empathize with all the details we don't relate to. Perhaps most of us haven't been the adoptive daughter of an alien warlord who turned us into a living weapon, but many have had the experience of living with abusive parental figures who passed on their anger and hatred to them. And from that vantage point, the rest can be clearly understood. And it's that empathy that brings me to the third and final most defining aspect of James Gunn, his empathy for the flawed. And not just the flawed, but the deeply flawed, truly horrendous individuals. Gunn has consistently found interest in exploring the lives and psychologies of inarguably bad people. Slither is a film about a woman escaping a toxic marriage, and the character of Grant, that is his actual name, is the other side of that toxic marriage. A man who makes her feel small, wants her to feel bad when she doesn't want to sleep with him, and is constantly jealous of other men even talking to her, only to go out and cheat on her himself. He is a terrible person who, when infected by this parasite, can only worry about how his wife won't love him anymore because he looks ugly now. But that is precisely what I'm talking about. What's clear in Grant's character is this fear of being alone. This constant insecurity that he's not good enough for her, and the only way he knows how to deal with that is to try and make her feel like less so that she believes she doesn't deserve someone better. Through all of it, Grant is a surprisingly sad, even somewhat pitiable character. Does that excuse any of what he does in the movie? No, not even a little bit. But Gunn wanted him to be more than just a bad person. That bad comes from somewhere, some insecurity, some fear, something. Not every villain gets this kind of treatment in Gunn's movies. There's not a whole lot to Jacques and Super or the Thinker and the Suicide Squad, other than them being just generally bad dudes. Even Ronan in the first first Guardians gets little more than just being crazy. But when just about every character in your movie is some level of bad and you care so much about those characters, you're going to find that some of those characters get a little more complicated. Someone like Bloodsport, who spends so much time running away from his capacity for good because it's so much easier to accept that he's selfish than to potentially fail at helping others. Or people like Frank or Libby in Super, who are both terrible human beings who hate themselves so much, so desperately want to be good people, that they end up coming all the way back around to being bad again. And that, I think, speaks to one of the main thematic drives of James Gunn's work, specifically that within the superhero genre, and the reason I think he's become such a beloved character within that genre. His movies are so often about people who desperately want to be good. Or perhaps more appropriately, people who desperately want to not be bad. They want to be the superheroes they read about in comic books. They want to find greater purpose in their lives. They want to be better than what they are. Superman, Spider-Man, Batman are these shining beacons of hope and heroism, unshakable in their moral resolve. They are people to look up to, and James Gunn chooses to show us things from the perspective of those people on the ground. The ones who don't do everything right, but who still want to try. And it's that spirit, that empathy for the flawed, people who want to be better, that persists through the Guardians themselves. The Guardians of the Galaxy aren't really heroes. They're criminals, assassins, bounty hunters, murderers. None of these people can be considered 100% good. Just look at how they're juxtaposed against the Sovereign at the beginning of Volume 2, a race of people who are basically eugenicists, hell-bound on making their entire race absolutely perfect through controlling their DNA in birthing pods. And meanwhile, Rocket apparently doesn't know how to control which eye he's winking with.
That was meant to be behind your back.
And then he steals their shiny glowing batteries and the Sovereign almost kill them. The Guardians' flaws have always been a defining aspect of their characters. Peter's emotional immaturity, Gamora's fear of intimacy, Rocket's insecurity. Those flaws are front and center and influence every action they take. But it's not until Volume 2 that we really start to dig into those flaws and understand why. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is a character drama more than anything else, and that's arguably one of the bigger reasons I think it's viewed with so much less favor than its predecessor. Guardians 2 is, for a large portion of its second act, just a lot of people sitting around and talking. It's not very plot heavy, and there aren't that many big action set pieces. It's just characters getting to know each other and themselves. And in that, it often sacrifices a sense of narrative flow for the sake of developing characters and relationships. And I understand that's not everyone's cup of tea. I get that people don't come to these movies to watch people just sit around and talk. But quite frankly, I don't believe the MCU has ever matched this level of character work. I don't believe the MCU has ever cared enough to explore this deep into its characters. Because while the MCU has always relied on the likability of its heroes, while its success can in large part be attributed to how well written and casted people like Tony Stark and Steve Rogers were, this is one of the only examples I can think of in this franchise where a movie truly cared about the why of these people. And if you've watched this channel at all, you know that I value that more than maybe anything else in regards to character writing. Not just a character's motives, but why they have those motives. Why they want what they want, why they care about what they care about. And while the original Guardian certainly cares about this as well, it's only in Volume 2 that I think it becomes the main driver of the narrative. The point of this movie is to explore who these people are. And the primary way that it does this is through pairing off each Guardian with a non-Guardian character. And these pairings are very purposefully chosen based on who is best suited to reveal each character's inner workings. And so we're going to take the time to explore each of those pairings and what they reveal about each of these characters. And the first is the relationship between Peter Quill and his father, Ego. In the first movie, Peter was defined by his resistance to anything but the most superficial of relationships.
Look, I'm gonna be totally honest with you. I forgot you're here.
Following the death of his mother and his kidnapping at the hands of a Ravager faction led by a man named Yondu Udonta, Peter became very wary of attachment. He knows what it is to lose the things you know, the things you care about. He knows just how temporary all of this is. But by the end of the first film, Peter had finally allowed himself the ability to care about something again. He allowed himself to face that death, the temporary nature of life, and see that it's worth it in spite of that. Or at least, it's worth trying. And when we find him in Volume 2, we find him trying and struggling. The very strong personalities and glaring flaws of the Guardians often get in the way of their collective objective, whether that's Drax's incompetence or Rocket's insistence on stealing whatever's not strapped down. And as the de facto leader of the group, he holds himself responsible for holding it all together and taking charge when things go awry. But he can't control any of these people. He can't make them do what he wants them to do, and they rarely ever choose to listen to him. And that isn't helped by Peter's own prideful nature and his tendency to stoke the flames and embrace the conflict rather than try to resolve it. And so often the situations they get into become battles for control that ultimately result in everyone losing. While Peter has decided to commit himself to this, while he's decided to try, everything in these first 20-ish minutes seem to be screaming at him that this isn't as worth it as he might have thought. And it's at the height of that feeling that a man descends from the sky and introduces himself.
My name is Ego, and I'm your dad, Peter.
And at first, Peter is very distrusting of this man claiming to be his father, no better represented than in his conversation with Gamora about a period in Peter's life where he went around telling all the other kids that his dad was David Hasselhoff, and the two of them have very different opinions of it.
I love that story.
I hate that story. It's so sad.
Where Gamora sees a desire for that familial bond, Peter only sees damage. He sees it as a pathetic instance of him wanting something he could never have. And so his dad showing up now just means that he didn't have to go through that. His dad is real, alive, and as far as he can tell, entirely capable of being there for him if he wanted to be. And so as Peter and Ego continue to interact, Peter continues to resist him. Ego gives him all of the exposition around how he is a celestial, a near godlike figure who has built around himself an entire planet along with a human body to go on a voyage through space searching for life. And Peter's only question is,
when did you meet my mother?
Ego says that it was with Meredith that he discovered what it was to love, and Peter's reaction to that is,
If you loved her, why did you leave her?
at all times, no matter what explanation of anything Ego is giving to Peter, Peter is actively pushing back. He doesn't want reasons for what caused him to go through the pain he did. He doesn't care that Ego had to return to his planet or his human form would wither. He doesn't care that Ego didn't want to be on a planet where Meredith was dead. Peter doesn't want to know how he got this damage. And then Ego tells him something that finally breaks through those barriers.
Over the millions and millions of years of my existence, I've made many mistakes, Peter. But you're not one of them.
The thing that every boy without a father wants to know. He wasn't a mistake. And Ego follows up on that by showing him that because he is part celestial, he has the ability to do the same kinds of things that Ego can. Ego makes Peter feel special. He makes him feel like it was worth it. Going through all the pain of not having a father because of Ego being his father was worth it if it resulted in this. If his damage led to something, was the foundation of something better. What Ego shows about Peter is that the primary reason Peter was so wary of all those attachments was because to him, the pain that he went through wasn't worth it. It didn't lead to anything. It didn't make him stronger. It didn't make him better. And at the beginning of this movie, he's starting to realize that those attachments and the inevitable pain that comes with them might even be holding him back. But with Ego being his dad, everything he's gone through now matters. Maybe Ego being his dad was the root cause of a lot of that damage, but it was all worth it because it all led to this. Ego being his father not only makes him stronger, it makes him stronger than almost anyone else, especially the Guardians themselves. The second pair that I want to look at is probably the most entertaining, if nothing else.
This gross bug lady is my new friend.
I'm learning many things, like I'm a pet and ugly.
Drax and Mantis are a very small part of the movie, and frankly there's not a whole lot to them, especially when compared to everyone else. But there is one specific scene involving them that I think says all we need to know, and it's probably the most subtle bit of character writing James Gunn has ever done. But first, A little bit of context. In Volume 2, Drax is a character who doesn't necessarily not care about how he affects others, but he does seem to not be very perceptive of when what he says can be hurtful. He's almost a little too honest, but rarely because he wants to be mean.
You just need to find a woman who is pathetic. Like you.
But in the first film, while he was certainly like that, he was also incredibly single-minded in his quest for vengeance against Ronan. At no point during his quest does he ever truly think about the potential consequences of what he does, and that's no better exemplified than when he called Ronan and his army directly to the Guardians in order to get his chance to kill him. And not only did Ronan kick his ass, it also ultimately resulted in 2 of his friends getting captured and the Infinity Stone Ronan was after being taken. And this was a wake-up call for him.
All the anger, all the rage, is just to cover my loss.
He was hiding from his grief, his pain, behind the cover of wrath and destruction. And because he wasn't willing to deal with and process that loss because he hid from it, he got everyone around him hurt. And in the second movie, Drax is a lot less angry, a lot less concerned with his mission for vengeance, very seldom bringing up his wife and daughter except to recall a pleasant memory. And this is where we get into Mantis. Mantis is Ego's pet. I think Drax hit the nail on the head there. She looks at herself as being nothing more than a servant, someone who exists only to aid her master and absolutely nothing more.
I'm a flea with a purpose.
She has the ability to alter emotions, using that mostly to help Ego sleep. But more importantly, she has the ability to feel what someone's feeling just by touching them. And she and Drax, both being not the most socially capable of individuals, become friends. And that's where we're at in this scene. The 2 of them are just talking to each other when Drax tells Mantis that she's ugly.
You are horrifying to look at, yes.
But upon Mantis's seeming hurt at that, Drax explains that it's actually a good thing.
When you're ugly and someone loves you, you know they love you for who you are. Beautiful people never know who to trust.
Well, then I'm certainly grateful to be ugly.
And following that, Drax begins to speak about his daughter and how Mantis reminds him of her innocence. And in the quiet, as Drax looks calmly into the middle distance, Mantis puts her hand to his bare shoulder and suddenly begins to sob, while Drax continues to look outward with that calm, contented expression. I think that when we take this with the context of what Drax did in the first movies, something becomes clear. That now, instead of hiding from his loss, he chooses to hide that feeling of grief from everyone else, pushing it deep down inside and hiding it behind that jovial temperament. And with that, I think his words before this also take on new meaning, because even with what he did in the first movie, his new friends continue to stand beside him now. Even though he showed his ugliest parts, they still continue to love him. And his way of reciprocating that love is to keep that grief that inspired him to anger under wraps. That grief helped no one. In fact, his response to it actively hurt others. And so, he keeps it all inside where only he and someone like Mantis could find it. The third pairing we need to explore is actually technically a trio: Rocket, Yondu, and Baby Groot. Rocket's had a rough life, to say the least. He is the way he is because of genetic experiments. In Rocket's own words, he was torn apart and put back together over and over, and that was essentially one of the first experiences of his intelligent life, being mistreated and abused to become something unlike anything else in the galaxy. And he takes a measure of pride in that status.
Ain't no thing like me except me.
He has to take pride in his uniqueness, because if he doesn't, all that's left is the keen awareness that his uniqueness is just a signal that he technically isn't supposed to exist. And in that, he's terribly insecure, consistently worried about how others think of him no matter how much he would say otherwise. Because deep down, he thinks of himself as a monster and latches onto anything anyone says that could validate that self-perception. Anytime someone calls him a rodent or vermin, anytime anyone mentions how weird he looks, anything that proves him right about himself. And it's in Volume 2 that we see him pushing even farther into that. Not only latching on to when anyone says bad things about him, but actively trying to get people to say bad things about him. Stealing batteries he doesn't need, insulting people, yelling at them, being just generally mean at all times. Pointing out other people's insecurities like Taserface's name in order to make himself feel better about his own insecurities.
What is your goal here? To get everybody to hate you? Because it's working.
Rocket tried to stay away from any kind of attachment or any notion of family. The only being he's allowed himself to care about is Groot, because as a very simple-minded creature, he might be fiercely loyal, but he's not going to give Rocket the kind of affection he's so afraid of, while also being an easy target for Rocket's jibes and jabs. But now, with Groot being Baby Groot, someone that he actually has to take care of, along with his acceptance of this newfound family, he's begun to start pushing everyone around him, trying to get everyone to hate him until they do. And Yondu is very similar in a lot of ways to Rocket. Sold into slavery at a young age, his parents, that first experience of the world, showed him nothing but the worst that people have to offer. And as such, he's also been mean and insulting, using his flying arrow to threaten and hurt people. He even broke the Ravager code by taking Peter when he was young, keeping him instead of delivering him to Ego because
he was skinny, could fit into places we couldn't, good for thieving.
And as such, he was exiled from the Ravagers, the only family he ever really knew, while Peter, the kid he basically raised, wants nothing to do with him anymore. And now, even his own crew has turned against him, that being the only reason that Rocket and Yondu get put together to begin with. These two characters are afraid of being loved, afraid of any kind of real affection, because as Yondu says,
just a little bit of love reminds you how big and empty that hole inside you actually is.
These two are mirrors to each other, reflecting back this terrible broken image of those who resist love, because that emptiness inside them is all they've ever known. And so they hurt the ones around them, push them away, because they need to prove that they don't deserve to be loved. They need to prove that all that pain they've gone through is all they could have ever gone through, because they don't want to face the possibility that they didn't have to be empty all this time. They don't want to face the idea that they didn't need to go through all they've gone through. Those people that hurt them weren't just acting according to nature, and the damage they've accrued wasn't just the way it had to be. By now, you might be noticing something of a pattern emerging. All of these characters, to at least some extent, struggle with the idea that their pain and grief are pointless. In this movie, they're trying to find a point to why they felt so alone, trying to keep that grief hidden so it doesn't get in the way, trying to prove that love just isn't real. These are people who are trying in whatever way they can to find some purpose in their pain, and if they can't, doing all they can to ignore it. Anything to make their damage good damage, to make it useful, to make it necessary, to become attached to it, obsessed with turning it into something good so that it doesn't have to be just damage. I think on many levels, that's what Volume 2 is about, the idea of good damage. And I think there's no clearer example of this than in our final pairing, Gamora and Nebula. Gamora has always been the most morally minded of the group. In the first movie, she was the most eager to escape from her life of hurting others. She's the most obviously ashamed of who she is and what she's done. How could she not be when people are yelling how terrible she is directly into her face? And one of her primary motivations in the first movie was to stop Ronan from killing an entire planet's worth of innocent people.
When he said he was going to destroy an entire planet for Ronan, I couldn't stand by him.
She is a character defined by a desire to escape who she's always been and what she's always been made to do. A character who wants nothing more than to just get away from the trauma of watching her parents die and being turned into an instrument of death by her adoptive father. And in Volume 2, she's gotten away, at least physically. She's pushing forward with a new family, trying to forget what's happened and move on toward the future, only for her to seemingly be the only one of the group with any kind of actual sense, while Peter and Rocket have pissing contests.
Either one of you could have gotten us through that field, had you flown with what's between your ears instead of what's between your legs.
And I think, on some level, she wants to play that role. It certainly causes her a lot of frustration being the only sensible one, but I think she wants to be the one who fixes problems. She's the one who tells Peter to go with Ego, but she's also the person who suspects there's something wrong about him and his planet. She's the one most invested in Baby Groot's well-being other than Rocket. She's the one who keeps contact with Rocket and becomes concerned when she loses contact contact. She's constantly on the lookout for problems and ways to fix them. After living a whole life of hurting innocent people on behalf of her father or whoever he sent her to, she's now nearly obsessed with fixing others' problems in an attempt to make up for all the problems she caused. But I also think the source of her frustration is in her inability to solve those problems. It's in the way that people push back against her attempts to fix things, the ways that those attempts can cause unintended rifts between her and her friends, like how Peter refuses to see that there's something wrong with Ego. And it's when a problem from her past arrives that she's forced to look at things a bit differently. In the first movie, there wasn't a lot to Nebula. She was Gamora's stepsister who hated their stepfather, and that's all we really got, except for one other crucial detail. Nebula seems to hate her sister almost as much as she hates her father, who openly preferred Gamora. And while Gamora never seemed to hate Nebula, even trying to bring her to the Guardians' side, Nebula was never willing to accept that invitation. And it's in Volume 2 that we start to understand why. Volume 2 actually starts with the Guardians picking up Nebula as a bounty. And if Gamora didn't hate Nebula in the first film, she certainly hates her now.
I'm hungry. Can we say that you're rude? No, it's not ripe yet, and I hate you.
Whatever hope Gamora must have had for Nebula in the first movie is gone, replaced by pure animosity. And after Nebula escapes later, helping the Ravagers to capture Yondu and Rocket, we learn that Thanos had Gamora and Nebula spar together, and that every time Gamora won, Thanos would replace a part of Nebula with machinery, wanting her to be Gamora's equal.
But she won. Again, and again, and again, never once refraining.
Every body part replaced was just another symbol of her inadequacy until her entire body stood as a monument to her own failure and the agonizing pain and suffering that came with it. Even now, whenever she's injured, that mechanical body becomes bent and broken, and she has to painfully realign all those parts, punished each and every time she fails, reaffirming that message. And so she goes after Gamora with the intent to kill her, finding her on Ego's planet and opening fire, chasing her into a nearby cave. Nebula crashes the ship and Gamora shoots it with a giant gun that fell off that ship, only to save Nebula from the wreckage when given the chance. And then Nebula, after realigning her body parts, attacks Gamora again and finally manages to beat her. They go back and forth about who won, Gamora berating her, Nebula yelling back until,
"Do not tell me what I want!
I don't need to tell you what you want, it's obvious!
You were the one who wanted to win, and I just wanted a sister!"
This sister she was always put at odds with, always forced to compete with, the problem she abandoned because she couldn't fix it, was just another scared child who just wanted to be loved. Staring her right in the face is a problem she not only never tried to fix, but also partially caused. The sister who needed her when she only showed indifference to her suffering.
Thanos pulled my eye from my head, and my brain from my skull, and my arm from my body.
All of Gamora's suffering and the pain she caused because of it inspired her to be better, fix problems instead of causing them. That pain was supposed to make her better, and Nebula's suffering was meant to make her better, meant to make her Gamora's equal. Eventually, she was supposed to be able to finally win, and now that she has, all that's left is the truth. All that pain, all that suffering, all that damage, and it left her with nothing more than a hollow victory, while that pain still remains. It was never good damage. Gamora couldn't help her sister, and Nebula's victory meant nothing. All of it, all the abuse, all the trauma was just damage and nothing else. All the Guardians are just kids with pain. Each Guardian and their partner in this movie is just another portrait of the ways that trauma can define a person for the rest of their lives, the ways that it can keep them from forming meaningful bonds, living however long they do with the implicit knowledge that there is something inside of them that is broken, something that is wrong, an experience that didn't do anything but hurt them. People who want to be better, struggling every day because of things they had no control over. And in their desperation to make that pain matter, they only ever end up pushing everyone else away. Because to believe that you could be happy, to believe that you could be loved, is to understand that you didn't have to be in pain. Someone could have loved you, someone could have helped you, but instead, They just hurt you or stood by while you were in pain. And it's with that idea in mind that I want to return back to where we started all this, Peter and Ego. Ego's primary goal in the film is to not be alone. At the start of his existence, he was simply floating through space, unaware of his own origin.
Utterly and entirely alone.
And while he was able to learn how to form molecules around himself, build this entire planet as his shell, he wanted more.
I desired meaning.
He initially sought that meaning through finding life on other planets, finding that he wasn't alone in the universe. And then he looked for it in the love he had for Peter's mother, and he wasn't alone in that way. And then he looked for it in the son they had together, and in that way, he wasn't alone. But that's not the full story. Do you remember that line I brought up a while ago?
Over the millions and millions of years of my existence, I've made many mistakes, Peter. But you're not one of them.
For Peter, that was an affirmation that he needed. As a boy without a father, he needed to know that he wasn't a mistake. But I think that Ego meant something a little different from what Peter realized. You see, Ego has had many other children besides Peter, but none of them carried the celestial genes like he needed them to. So he killed them, buried their bodies in the caves of his planet. But Peter was different. Peter had those celestial genes. Peter wasn't a mistake. And so now, Ego can do what he wants to do. Enact a plan he calls the expansion, expanding himself over the entire galaxy by planting extensions of himself on every planet, allowing him to take over those planets.
I need to fulfill life's one true purpose: to grow and spread, covering all that exists.
But he needs the power of two Celestials to do that, and he wants Peter to do this of his own free will, so he keeps certain information to himself, tells Peter what he wants to hear, makes him feel not only special, but powerful, superior. All the unfortunate effects of having Ego as his dad, all the pain he went through, it was all just so he could eventually become one of the strongest beings in the universe, side by side with his father. And the more Ego plays to Peter's, well, ego, the more that he distances Peter from his friends, namely Gamora, whom Peter becomes convinced is just jealous of his newfound power. And the icing on the cake is that Peter and Ego both are immortal.
Everything around us, including the girl, everything is temporary. We are forever.
Living forever, working with the greatest possible purpose there could ever be, to be omnipotent and eternal, have power over all. Everything will be him, and Peter will be right by his side, and everything, all the pain, all the trauma, all the hardship will have finally been worth it for these two gods who are finally not alone. Ego's very existence is a direct question to the idea of accepting death, accepting endings. Why accept death as a part of life when there is a possibility that it doesn't have to be? Why accept that everything is temporary when there is an option for it to go on, getting only more powerful over time? If the world goes on, if we go on, if the universe goes on, then our lives can have meaning. Our pain can have meaning. What better existence could there be than for things to go on forever? There's this video on YouTube you may have seen. Hell, with over 91 million views, you probably have. It's a video titled Time-Lapse of the Future, A Journey to the End of Time. And it is exactly what it says it is. A visualization starting in 2019 when it was made and moving forward through time trillions upon trillions of years, showing how scientists now imagine the story of the universe will unfold. As stars die off one by one, the universe becomes darker and darker, the only remnants of light remaining being white dwarfs shining only as bright as a full moon on a clear night. And eventually those stars begin to die too, until the only large structures left in the universe universe are black holes, sucking up every last particle of light and matter that may still exist. And while those black holes will remain orbiting around and merging with other black holes for trillions of years, eventually they too will die in gigantic explosions lighting up the void. And as the universe continues to expand and entropy marches on at a time unimaginable, the final black hole will explode in a brilliant burst of light, a final breath as the universe goes completely dark and time becomes meaningless. It's a sobering experience, to say the least, and somewhat horrifying, to say the most. And I think at the heart of that existential horror is the fear that none of what we do or go through matters. One day it will all be dust, and someday after it won't even be that. One day there won't be anyone left to even forget that we existed, and if things don't go on, if endings are inevitable, if progress will be halted at one point or another, if the universe eventually goes dark, then what is the point of any of it? The idea that one day everything will be nothingness makes all of this pain we go through, all this trauma that weighs on us day in and day out, meaningless, and that is unacceptable. If this damage isn't good damage, if it doesn't lead to something, if it isn't my character development, or at least make me funny, if one day every last trace of my and everyone else's existence will be wiped away by the endless march of entropy, any evidence that we ever persevered, converted at some inconceivable point in the future into aimless photons floating about the void, then what was it all for? What was any of it really for? And a fear that goes right alongside that is the fear that all the good we experienced in spite of the bad, all the good that may have come from the bad, what it inspired us to do or to be, will be gone too. All the people we loved, all the people who loved us, all the good days and what we accomplished and who we helped will be indistinguishable from the pain. It will all be darkness. It will all be void. And in a very strange way, the MCU now kind of feels like a representation of that fear. Starting in Phase 3 and only increasing up to now, the MCU has become obsessed with setup. Just about everything, every movie and show has to be, in one way or another, setting something up for a different movie or show. Civil War sets up Spider-Man Homecoming, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier sets up a new Captain America movie, Loki sets up the multiverse and Kang. What comes with every new MCU project is a promise that it will, whether in a major or minor way, move the overarching plot of the MCU forward. Marvel always has its sights aimed toward the future. They always have some idea of where the story is going, and it can only be progressed in one way. Constant setup through the individual entries of this franchise. And my problem with this is that it means there is so often no such thing as a personal story in the MCU. When everything exists to set up something else, personal expression becomes nearly impossible, because every payoff, every resolution, every thematic conclusion is just there to make way for something else. The MCU becomes a franchise stuck in a state of perpetual setup. Even Endgame, the last MCU thing I loved, in hindsight doesn't feel so much like an ending as it does a setup for the future of the MCU. Nothing can stand on its own. Nothing can truly end. It is all a part of a single force pushing onward forever, slowly becoming everything. Ego is a being so hell-bent on giving his entire existence purpose that he eventually arrives at the conclusion that the only purpose worth having is to become everything and control everyone, to take the bridle of the cosmos and lead it to where it needs to go. Ego's entire plan is to become the exact opposite of limited and temporary, to make sure that he will always matter. But he does this by forgoing any sense of genuine love. He doesn't love Peter. He only had Peter so that he could use him for this plan, not unlike those people who want to have children solely so they can leave a legacy. But he did love Meredith. In fact, he loved her so much that he went back to her 3 times, and he knew that if he went back again, he'd never leave. He would die there with Meredith, and his purpose would go unfulfilled.
But it broke my heart to put that tumor in her head.
In the end, Power and eternity cannot coexist with love and connection. They are diametrically opposed. To have one, you must kill the other. To accept love means to accept the temporary nature of that love. To forge connections means to accept that one day those connections will fade away, and Ego wasn't willing to accept that. He chose purpose, prioritized what is eternal over what doesn't last. And that realization is what finally wakes Peter up. And if we needed any more proof that Ego never really cared about Peter, he responds to this by forcibly using Peter anyway and then smashing his Walkman with his mother's tape still inside, the last vestige of his mother now destroyed, as though to make the point of just how fragile and temporary what it stood for is. And then Yondu and Rocket show up and crash a ship into him. And what follows is all of the pairings I've talked about coming together to fight against Ego. And in this third act, most of these characters get a chance to finally accept their traumas as they are and act with them. Rocket uses the batteries he stole to build a bomb that can blow up Ego's core, converting that trauma response into something productive. Nebula uses her robotic body, that symbol of her failure to meet the standards of an abusive father, to power the weapons that destroy the Sovereign Fleet who came after the batteries. Mantis, with the help of Drax, realizes her own power and stands up to Ego by putting him to sleep. And while these are all genuinely great moments, there's really only 3 characters in this climax that we need to track: Peter, Ego, and Yondu. To start with, before the actual fight begins, Yondu reveals to Peter that it wasn't because he was skinny that he didn't deliver him to Ego.
Well, once I figured out what happened to them other kids, I wasn't just gonna hand you over.
He didn't want to admit he did something to help somebody else. That would have been counterproductive to him making everyone hate him, so he made it a selfish motive instead. But this admission shows that he's at least beginning now to push past those barriers of self-sabotage. He even tries to give Peter some advice, telling him that he doesn't use his head to fly his arrow, but he gets interrupted before he can finish. Together, everyone pushes into Ego's center, and as Yondu and Nebula take on the Sovereign Fleet, Peter, Rocket, and Groot work to plant the bomb on Ego's core, while Gamora, Drax, and Mantis keep Ego asleep. Soon, the Sovereign Fleet is taken out by Nebula and Yondu, but at the cost of their ship, the debris of which knocks Mantis unconscious, awakening Ego. Drax gets sent up to the surface with Mantis, Gamora and Nebula fall as the floor comes apart, and Yondu, Peter, and Rocket continue to fight against Ego, while Groot continues to search for Ego's core. And at first, the trio is able to fend Ego off, but they soon become overwhelmed by Ego's power, everyone becoming trapped, including Peter, whose power is used to continue the expansion, many innocent people getting caught in its wake. And it's all nothing to Ego. He's only aggravated that Peter can't see what he sees, that he's special, 1 in trillions.
What greater meaning can life possibly have to offer?
And almost as though in response, Yondu yells to Peter from afar,
I don't use my head to fly the arrow, boy! I use my arm!
I think putting these 2 lines side by side is really important, because here are these 2 father figures that Peter has had in his life. His blood-related father that provided him with a fantasy, and the closest thing he had to a father before him that only provided imperfection and, frankly, abuse. And while Ego goes on about his purpose, a purpose that is killing hundreds, maybe even thousands of people, a cold, logical understanding of his reason for being, Yondu tells him that the way he flies his arrow is by using his heart, following what he feels rather than what he thinks. And with that, Peter begins to remember all those moments of joy and love he's had with these people he cares about. Power begins to surge through him, and he breaks free of his bonds, attacking Ego and freeing everyone else at the same time. So much of this final act is people taking the results of their trauma, whether that's trauma responses or physical or mental scars, and turning them into vehicles to do good and help others, acknowledging what it's done to them and moving forward with it rather than constantly looking to the past in order to try and justify it or give it purpose. And truly, I think the best example of this, and perhaps the greatest example of why I love this movie, is in the choice that Yondu makes. While Peter distracts Ego, Groot manages to plant the bomb, press the right button that sets a 5-minute timer, and gets away. Rocket picks him up and they fly to Yondu, telling him that they have to go, but he refuses to leave.
I ain't done nothing right my whole damn life, Rat. You need to give me this.
Rocket gives him a single arrow rig and spacesuit. They fly back up to the ship where everyone else has already made it except for Peter and Yondu. And with time running low before the bomb goes off, Rocket knows they can't wait any longer for Peter to return. And so, after stopping Gamora from going to save him, he calls for them to go. Back in the planet, the two Celestials, tired, continue to fight. Ego is practically begging Peter to stop it, now for the first time having to face something like mortality.
You are a god. If you kill me, you'll be just like everybody else.
What's so wrong with that?
The bomb goes off and everything, including Ego, begins to crumble. Peter's power goes away as he looks around him one last time at what he's destroyed. The thing that made him special, the thing that made him matter, that gave him purpose. And now it's all gone, and he'll be gone with it. But before it all falls apart, Yondu swoops in with arrow rig and flies Peter up out of the planet and towards the atmosphere. And as they're flying, he says the one thing he's kept inside for so long.
I'm sorry I didn't do none of it right. I'm damn lucky you, my boy.
He puts his one spacesuit onto Peter, and as they exit the atmosphere into the cold grip of space, the planet below imploding into nothing, Peter begins to realize what Yondu's doing. And he yells and he screams much like he did when his mother died, but just like then, there's nothing he can do. Yondu dies, and Peter is left in tears, floating with him in the void. I don't see this moment as a redemption. I don't look at Yondu's sacrifice as though it undid all of the harm that he did to Peter or even justified it. But that's not what Yondu's trying to do. He's just taking responsibility for his actions and trying in this final act to do at least one thing right. Just one. Yondu is not a good person. None of the Guardians are. They're people who have been for a long time attached to their respective traumas that have distanced them from others, caused them to hurt people because they'd rather accept themselves as bad because of what they've been through than grow and heal. But what Yondu does here, this act of sacrifice, is not to justify his pain or the pain he's inflicted on others. It's just to, at least one time, show that he did care. Show that he did appreciate whatever good there was by accepting his own death if it means one last moment with a son he didn't deserve. It's the exact opposite of Ego. And I think that's not only why I love Volume 2, but also why Volume 3 is the only MCU movie that can get me excited, because it's billed as an end. This may not be the last time we see these characters. Frankly, I'd be a little surprised if it was. But it will be the end of this story that started almost 10 years ago. It will be, for me, and I think a lot of others, a goodbye. Not just to the Guardians, but to the MCU as a whole. You've probably heard the term superhero fatigue recently, and I think that state of perpetual setup is at the heart of it. Because when you refuse to let a story end, focus so much on the future and how you will keep going into infinity rather than appreciating the story you're telling now. Eventually that story and the audience begin to tire. Eventually, without any kind of true ending, I just stopped caring. But Guardians 2, in contrast, is so uninterested in setup. It's so unimportant to the overarching saga. There are no Infinity Stones, no Thanos outside of him being Nebula and Gamora's dad, no major characters from elsewhere in the MCU playing big roles. And because of that, it is allowed to just tell this story about these flawed, broken people learning to appreciate what and who they have while it lasts.
Sometimes that thing you're searching for your whole life, it's right there by your side all along.
Because nothing really lasts. People don't last, stories don't last, love doesn't last. Because if it did, it wouldn't be love. And I think that's what scares us. If something ends, was it ever even real? If it all ends in nothingness without a trace of what we went through left behind, why did we go through it at all? I don't want to fall out of love with the MCU, because if I do, doesn't that mean I spent my entire teenage life dedicated to the wrong thing? Shouldn't I have spent that time caring about something better, something that would last? But just because something ends doesn't mean it wasn't real. It doesn't mean that love was ingenuine or that it didn't matter. If anything, it is only because something ends that it can matter. We can't define our experience of life by our attempts to justify the pain that's a part of it. We have to define that experience by the love that still exists. And that can be a hard thing to accept. It's hard to accept that you didn't have to feel that pain or go through that trauma. It's hard to be okay with the idea that pain isn't necessary. And it can take a lot of time, a lot of work, and a lot of therapy to find that acceptance. But I think it all starts with a shift in perspective, that we are not here to justify our own pain, but to appreciate love for as long as it remains. And even if one day it will all be photons floating about the void, that experience was still real, and what could possibly matter more than that? In the end, as the Guardians all begin to rest after everything that's happened, after cremating Yondu and spreading his ashes among the stars, Ravager ships begin to appear one by one, filling up the dark void. And as all the Guardians gather to watch, the ships begin to fire out bright colors like fireworks in the night sky, filling the dark with color like how the explosion of black holes will one day bathe the void in light. It's the colors of a gourd, a Ravager funeral, a final glorious expression of just how much Yondu and what he chose to do mattered to all these people. Those colors will dissipate eventually. That light will one day be gone, but for now, in this temporary moment, they can appreciate this beauty and the love it signifies for as long as it remains. The Guardians of the Galaxy are those people who don't feel like they belong. They're the ones who maybe even believe they don't deserve to belong or are afraid of belonging. Their pain makes them special, makes them better. They're one in trillions, but in reality, everybody has damage. Everyone struggles. Everyone has felt pain. It's not a unique experience. It's not something to be proud of or to hold on to, but it's also nothing to be ashamed of. A fact that doesn't need to be run away from. It can just be. The Guardians are the broken ones, the flawed ones, the afraid and the traumatized, and the ones carrying so much pain that kept them from others for so long. But together they can accept each other as they are and appreciate the love they have while it's here. Nebula can be a Guardian, Mantis can be a Guardian, Yondu can be a Guardian, I can be a Guardian, you can be a Guardian for as long as this lasts. Endings are inevitable. One day, even the MCU will end. The one thing we can do is appreciate what we have now, recognize when our time is over, step aside gracefully, and allow whatever comes next to take our place, letting ourselves become one with the endless and peaceful nothing, the forever and beautiful sky.